Abraham returned with the goods. Verse 16. Israel returned with the goods. Ezra and Nehemiah. Abraham went up to Jerusalem. Verse 17. Israel returned to Jerusalem. Ezra and Nehemiah. Abraham met Melchizedek. Verse 18. Israel will meet Jesus, the Melchizedek priest. Hebrews 7 verse 21. Abraham's enemies were defeated. Verse 17. Israel will be delivered from their enemies. Zechariah 14 verses 1 and 2. In Genesis 15 verse 18, Israel was promised the land from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates, and in the millennial reign of Christ, this promise will be fulfilled. Ezekiel 44 through 47. There are main personalities and prophets in the Bible whose lives correlate. This cannot be a coincidence, but by divine design. Few would ever compare the links between the lives of Jacob and Moses, especially considering Jacob tricked his brother twice to get his birthright and blessing, had to wrestle with God, and came out of the fight with a limp and a name change. Genesis 27 verse 36 and 32 verses 24 and 25. However, both Jacob and Moses were about 40 years old when they went into exile. Notice the many other comparisons. Here is a list of the parallels of the life of Jacob and the life of Moses. Jacob sinned by lying. Genesis 27. Moses sinned by murdering an Egyptian. Exodus 2 verse 12. Jacob fled for his life to Syria. Genesis 28. Moses fled for his life to the Median desert. Exodus 2 verse 15. Jacob journeyed to the east. Genesis 29 verse 1. Moses traveled east of Egypt. Median is east of Egypt. Jacob met his wife at a well of water. Genesis 29 verse 10. Moses met his wife at a well of water. Exodus 2 verse 16. Jacob worked for his father-in-law. Genesis 29 verses 14 through 29. Moses worked for his father-in-law. Exodus 3 verse 1. Jacob tended sheep and cattle. Genesis 30 verse 36. Moses tended sheep. Exodus 3 verse 1. Jacob received an angelic visitation. Genesis 31 verse 11. Moses received a visitation from an angel. Exodus 3 verse 2. Jacob returned to the land. Genesis 31 verse 21. Moses returned to Egypt. Exodus 7. Jacob took his family back to the land. Genesis 31 verse 17. Moses led Israel back to their land. Exodus 12 and 13. Jacob was called a prince with God. Genesis 32 verse 28. Moses became a prince over Israel. Exodus 2 verse 14. As an additional note, Jacob had two wives, Leah and Rachel. Not many realized that Moses had two wives, Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro, the priest of Midian, Exodus 2 verse 21, and an Ethiopian wife he married and left in Egypt. The first 40 years while Moses was living in Egypt, he defeated the king of Ethiopia in battle and married the king's daughter named Tharbus. Moses suddenly departed from Egypt at age 40. He left Tharbus behind, believing he would never return to Egypt. Moses thus married Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro in Midian. 40 years later, Moses returned to Egypt, leading Israel out. Some suggest Moses may have brought his Egyptian wife Tharbus out of Egypt with him when he departed. This would be the Ethiopian wife that Miriam criticized, Numbers 12 verse 1. This two-wife theory is interesting since Jacob also had two wives. Moses' life mirrors one of Israel's greatest prophets, Elijah. Rabbis consider both men two of Israel's greatest prophets. Both fasted for 40 days, Exodus 34 verse 28 and 1 Kings 19 verse 8. Both became depressed and requested to die, Exodus 32 verse 32 and 1 Kings 19 verse 4. Both dealt with idolatry, Moses dealt with the gold calf, and Elijah dealt with the false prophets on Carmel. Exodus 32 and 1 Kings 18. Both saw the fire of God fall. Numbers 16 verse 35 and 1 Kings 18 verse 38. Both were threatened with death. Numbers 14 verse 10 and 1 Kings 19 verse 2. Both experienced God's presence in the cleft of a rock. Exodus 33 verse 22 and 1 Kings 19 verses 8 and 9. Both left a successor in charge. Moses had Joshua, and Elijah had Elisha. Numbers 27 verses 10 through 22 and 1 Kings 19 through 21. Both have no visible grave. Elijah went up, and Moses' grave was hidden. 2 Kings 2 and Deuteronomy 34 verse 6. Both sought God in a cleft and a cave on Mount Horeb. Exodus 33 verses 21 through 23 and 1 Kings 19 verses 8 through 11. Both heard and saw the manifestations of God on Mount Horeb. Exodus 32 and 1 Kings 19. Both appeared at the Mount of Transfiguration. Matthew 17 verses 1 through 3. Elijah was translated alive in a chariot of fire in the same area where Moses was buried, in the plains of Pisgah, across from Jericho. We have looked at how Moses and Elijah parallel. Now observe how Elijah's life is an example of a prophetic rotation or a looped event that repeats in the future. During Elijah's ministry, he called down fire from heaven during a 42-month drought. 1 Kings 18. Elijah was received into heaven alive and will return to earth as one of the two witnesses during the tribulation. Malachi 4 verse 5 and Revelation 11 verse 3. When Elijah returns, he will repeat the miracles and experiences he endured previously, serving as God's prophet when two wicked people ruled, Ahab and Jezebel. The second time, the two evil ones will be the Antichrist and false prophet, Revelation 13 verses 1 through 11. This list details how Elijah's second appearance in the book of Revelation, chapters 6 through 13, will reflect his first appearance in 1 Kings 17 through 2 Kings 2. 42-month judgment on Ahab, 1 Kings 17 verse 1. 42-month judgment on the earth, Revelation 11 verse 2. 42 months of no rain, 1 Kings 17 verse 1. 42 months of no rain, Revelation 11 verse 6. A famine was in the land, 1 Kings 18 verse 2. A famine will be in the land, Revelation 6 verse 5. Food was being rationed, 1 Kings 18 verse 4. Food will be rationed, Revelation 6 verse 6. The brook of water dried up, 1 Kings 17 verse 7. The river Euphrates dries up, Revelation 16 verse 12. Jews were hiding in caves, 1 Kings 18 verse 4. Jews will be hiding in the wilderness, Revelation 12 verse 14. A faithful remnant exists, 1 Kings 19 verse 18. A faithful remnant exists, Revelation 12 verse 17. Fire fell from heaven, 1 Kings 18 verse 38. Fire will fall from heaven, Revelation 13 verse 13. A false religion swept the land, 1 Kings 18 verse 19. A false religion will sweep the earth, Revelation 13 verse 14. 7,000 would not bow down, 1 Kings 20 verse 15. 7,000 will die in Jerusalem, Revelation 11 verse 13. Elijah was caught up to heaven, 2 Kings 2 verse 11. After dying, he will be caught up, Revelation 11 verse 12. Even the New Testament clearly demonstrates these patterns, both cyclic and repetitive, when examining the birth of Christ to the future millennial kingdom and the beginnings of Israel to the kingdom of Solomon. Observe how these events reflect off one another. Israel from their birth to the kingdom, and Christ from his birth to his kingdom. Born in Canaan land, and born in Canaan land. Suddenly moved to Egypt to save the nation, and suddenly moved to Egypt to save the Holy Family. Baptized in the Red Sea, and baptized in the Jordan River. Entered the wilderness for 40 years of testing, and entered the wilderness for 40 days of testing. Returned to Israel in power and miracles, and returned to Israel with power and miracles. Had 12 tribes, and had 12 disciples. Joshua, named Yeshua, died, and Jesus, Yeshua, died. The enemy was left in the land, and the enemy was left in the land. Began to possess the land, and saints began to preach the gospel. Israel forsook the Lord, and the church began to forsake the Lord. God raised up deliverers, and God raises up reformers. The nation chose men above God, and the nations looked to men and not to God. King Saul rose up persecuting the righteous, and the Antichrist rises up and persecutes Israel. Saul stopped the priests' sacrifices, and the Antichrist stops the sacrifices. King David comes and subdues enemies. King Jesus comes and defeats Satan and the Antichrist. Solomon built the temple in Jerusalem, and Jesus will build the temple in Jerusalem. Solomon established a reign of peace, and Jesus establishes 1,000 years of peace. Scholars have stated for centuries that the Old Testament is the New Testament concealed, and the New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. It was God who declared, "Let them bring forth and show us what will happen. Let them show the former things, what they were, that we may consider them, and know the latter end of them, or declare to us things to come." Isaiah 41, verse 22. The narrative on the ruling actions of biblical kings can also reveal future events. One such example is the pattern of King Jeroboam and the Antichrist. 9 comments the Bible makes about Jeroboam's rule are the same 9 found in the biblical revelation of the final world dictator, the Antichrist. Old Testament references to Jeroboam in 1 Kings and 1 Chronicles parallel Antichrist references in Daniel and Revelation. He rules whatever his soul desires. 10 tribes, or kings, form an alliance, but 3 pulled away. He is appointed king by the 10 other tribes/kings. He honors the god of forces or military power. He sets up idols and abominations. A prophet arises to challenge the wicked leader. He is the most wicked leader up until that time. He will be given to the fowls of the air. He will prevail against the holy ones. Cycles of empires. These same prophetic loops and rhythmic repetitions are found not just among individuals, but also among the empires of prophecy. In early history, we read of the Tower of Babel, Genesis 10 verse 10 and 11 verse 4, the world's first global government. Hundreds of years later, Daniel is a captive in the city of Babylon, Daniel 1. In Revelation, at the time of the end, the name Babylon reappears as a religious and economic force that is destroyed. Just as the Tower of Babel fell, Mystery Babylon will also fall, Genesis 11 and Revelation 17 through 19. In Daniel's time, the Persian military machine captured Babylon, setting up the 4th major prophetic empire. Today, the Iranians are the Persians and use the name Persian to identify their people. Persia is rising again and will lead an Islamic coalition against Israel at the Battle of Gog and Magog, Ezekiel 38, verse 5. The patterns of the ancient Roman Empire have been repeated with the rise of the modern American empire. Thus, patterns of previous empires can move in repetitive cycles.